This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a very special edition of History Off the Page. I want to start out with a quick apology. Those of you that follow the show regularly know I haven't dropped an episode in about 4 months, and I just wanted to say that is partly because of the subject that we're going to talk about today. Now, for those of you who don't know me, this is your first episode of History Off the Page. I'm Dr. Jason Hansen. I am a professor of modern European history at Furman University. And even though Israel-Palestine is a little bit outside of what you might call my normal topics that I talk about, I've spent the last 4 months doing a lot of research trying to unpack a lot of this because there is such tremendous interest in learning more about the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Normally, the podcast focuses on modern European history, and you can go to our website, www.historyoffthepage.com, if you want to see some of the other topics that we've covered, or you can just look on the streaming service of your choice. But we are back, and we're going to spend the next couple episodes discussing the history behind the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I want to give you a sense of how the 2023 Hamas attacks and the subsequent Israeli invasion of Gaza, all of the history that kind of figures into the background context that kind of answers the question of how we got here. For those of you that, again, are familiar with the podcast, this should be something similar to what I did back in 2022 when the Ukraine-Russia war broke out, and I tried to give you a sense of what are the different perspectives involved in the conflict, why did it come about, what is the history behind the situation. So that's basically what we're going to try to do over the course of the next couple episodes. Now, before we get into that history, I want to spend this first episode making some more general observations about the conflict and the way that it's being talked about in public discourse. To put it bluntly, I'm really frustrated by a number of ways that this kind of discourse, the conversation is unfolding. I'll talk about this more in a second. I feel like people have sort of their view on it. They have their ordering of history, and they're not really understanding the broader context, right? They have their kind of narrow particular point of view. They want to understand it as being one thing or another. And so we don't kind of get the broad overview. We don't get the deep history as well of what's going on. And so that's kind of the purpose behind this podcast. Now, I know that passions surrounding the topic are understandably very high, right? People feel very connected to the issue. We see images of suffering coming out of places like Gaza, coming out of southern Israel. And it leads us to become kind of very emotional. It leads us to obviously sympathize with some of the people. So it's understandable, why people aren't sitting around going, oh, okay, what does the quote unquote other side think about this? Right? I understand why people want a sort of more simple narrative. I understand why people are throwing around words like anti-Semitism and genocide and apartheid, and trying to understand this history in very moral terms. And this is a good thing, I would argue, right? We should look at the world and see suffering and not just say, oh, okay, it's suffering, I don't care. What's the latest thing I can buy? Let me get lost in virtual reality. No, we want to be compassionate. We want to think about the world around us, about the suffering of others, and we want to stop that suffering. So it's good that we care and that we have these deeply moral feelings about what's going on today and what's going on historically. On the other hand, as I mentioned, there's a tendency in these moments to kind of view things from a very narrow perspective. We have a tendency to kind of ignore things that are inconvenient to our narrative or our perspective or the kind of side we feel sympathy with. We feel a sense of anger and outrage, and we want someone to blame for it. We want justice for those who are suffering. The problem is that when we adopt this kind of selective way of thinking, we often have a tendency to make things worse. The desire for justice is important and valuable, but we have to be careful because it can also serve as the justification for additional violence. And oftentimes the other side doesn't perceive it as, oh, okay, this is justice coming upon us. They perceive this as a new sense of injustice, right? And so you can actually fuel conflict by the way that we think about and talk about events that are going on. Now, I said before, my primary training is in European history, and one of the places where I've seen this bear out is in the Balkans. I've actually spent a lot of time there. I did a Fulbright in the Balkans. One of the things you notice if you go there is that the different sort of participants in the breakup of Yugoslavia have very different stories or narratives that they tell about why and how that took place. If you go, for example, to Croatia, and you talk to Croats and you say, what happened? Tell me the story. The kind of McDonald's version of it is, in 1991, the country moved towards more democracy, we wanted more freedom, and the Serbs under Milosevic did not want to allow that. Right? The Serbs tried to revolt, the Serbs tried to repress our freedoms, and in the course of that war, the Serbs carried out a number of crimes against humanity. They shelled cities. They destroyed communities. They committed genocide. You go down the coast a little bit, go inlands a bit to the mountains. You talk to people from Bosnia. When I say people from Bosnia, I mean especially Bosniaks. Bosniaks are Bosnian Muslims. You ask them what happened. They say, yeah, a lot of what the Croats said is true, but they left out this one little part when Croatia actually or Croats declared war on the Bosniaks and fought a kind of civil war there as well. So what happens when you go to Serbia? Well, how on earth could the Serbs defend these things, right? There's also genocide that happens in Bosnia, a larger episode of genocide and certainly ethnic cleansing. So you ask the Serbs about it and they say, well, actually, that was a civil war. We weren't really a part of it. But let's talk about World War II. Because during World War II, the Croatian Ustaše regime committed genocide against Serbs. Let's talk about the NATO bombings of 1999. We're not going to spend a lot of time focusing on Kosovo and kind of what NATO is trying to do, but let's remember the death of Serbs at the hands of NATO. And so what you get are three different stories here that produce a sense of victimhood and a desire for justice. None of these narratives is necessarily wrong. None of them are historically inaccurate. They're not lying about things. The issue is that they focus on different parts of the narrative. They highlight certain things. They kind of leave other things out. And so what you get is a focus on victimhood that continues tensions to this day. If you go to Bosnia, the situation in Bosnia between Bosnian Serbs, Bosniaks, and Bosnian Croats is still pretty tense. So I offer this podcast not as a kind of polemic, not as a, hey, this is the defense of Israel. Hey, this is the condemnation of Israel. It's not an effort to kind of place it all in moral terms where one side is guilty and the other side isn't. This is a podcast to help you understand the broader picture, the broader history, and kind of how both sides see it and how those visions then can lead to conflict today. Now, I already know I'm going to piss some of you off. Some of you are not looking for that. Some of you want justice. Some of you want political mobilization. Some of you are feeling a sense of righteousness. There are plenty of other podcasts out there for you if that's what you're looking for. I hope you'll stick around, though, to hear about the different perspectives, about the deeper history, and about all the elements, if you will, that go into this story. Because I'm going to make a number of observations here. And the first observation that I want to make is that the history of this region, and especially of this conflict, is complicated. It is enormously complicated. It is incredibly difficult to wrap your head around the ways that things going on in the 1880s and 1890s affect things today. It is incredibly complicated because it is not just an Israeli-Palestinian dispute. The way it gets talked about in media, the way proponents, people that sympathize for either side, the way they talk about it is either Israel-Palestine. Sometimes they talk about it as being Jewish-Arab or Jewish-Muslim. But it's not a story of just two actors or two groups. It is multifaceted. If you look again at the deeper history and causes of the situation today, you'll see that this doesn't just involve Israel and Palestine. It doesn't even just involve the other Arab states. These entities all have very complicated relationships with each other. The Arab states have complicated relationships with Israel. Relationships that have changed over the course of time, sometimes rapidly. They also have a complicated relationship with the Palestinians. They also have a complicated relationship with each other. So what the Jordanian vision is of what they want to happen versus what the Egyptian vision is versus what the Syrian vision is versus what the Iranians are trying to do right now versus what the Saudis are trying to do right now, right? All of these are kind of moving parts in a very complicated story that change over time. And they make trying to resolve this incredibly difficult. A lot of the actors in this story outside of the Israelis and Palestinians are not trying to necessarily solve the problem on behalf of one group or the other. They care about winning more territory. They have, at least historically, cared about getting rid of their rivals. So there is a lot of shifting going on to the story. And again, I'm going to go over this in more detail once we get into the heart of the podcast. But just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, let's take Jordan. Jordan, or what was before the 1940s referred to as Transjordan. The Jordanians, at least their government, has had a tendency to vacillate between support and hostility for Israel, or more broadly, the Zionist project. Just to give you just one fascinating episode in this longer story. In 1967, as many of you know, Israel ends up fighting a war against many of its neighbors. It's called the Six-Day War. There's a lot of kind of, again, deeper history to it. Egyptians, are they threatening? Are they posturing? Israel's not sure. Israeli motivations may be complicated. Israel says, we can't wait. They launch a kind of preemptive war. At any rate, Jordan ends up entering the war. Now, they're badly mauled by the Israeli army, or the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, and they actually lose their most important, most prosperous province, which is the West Bank. So you would think this would be some incredible grievance. Israelis and Jordanians are going to hate each other. This is going to be Germany, France, like it was in the 19th century. But 3 years later, just 3 years later, the Jordanians find themselves at war with the Palestinians. Or, because we're going to complicate this notion in a few minutes, they find themselves at war basically with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. Now, as part of this war, the Jordanians actually work hand in hand with the Israelis to prevent the Syrians from invading Jordan to help the Palestinians. There's a lot of side changing going on there. There's a lot of complications. There's a lot of, why are these people helping these people and this is going on? Weren't the PLO and the Jordanians, weren't they just allies in the Six-Day War in 1967? The Egyptians have both supported and suppressed Palestinian resistance organizations depending on the politics of the moment. One of the big concerns right now, and I would say a very legitimate concern, is the question of starvation in Gaza. Right? Israel is blockading Gaza, as we're recording this in January of 2024. There is a border to Gaza that does not face Israel. It faces Egypt. That border is also closed. The Egyptians are also part of this story that's unfolding. The Syrians, for the most part, have never been particularly fond of the Israelis. But there is a brief moment in 1976 when they become kind of a temporary enemy of my enemy is my at least person I can get along with during the more complicated Lebanese civil war. And I don't know that we'll have a lot of time to get into the Lebanese civil war because one could argue it is in the ballpark of being as complicated as Israel-Palestine. Lebanon fought a civil war for 15 years, partly between Muslims and Christians, partly it's about the PLO, partly it's about Syria, partly it's about Israel. That war claimed the lives of 150,000 people. 150,000 people died in the Lebanese Civil War. I can keep giving you examples about this, by the way. So, okay, how about Iraq? How did Iraq under Saddam Hussein feel about the Palestinians? When the Gulf War breaks out, the first Gulf War in 1991, the Palestinians, the PLO at least, chooses to side with Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein starts like lobbing missiles into Israel. He tries to kind of transform this into a kind of Western versus Arab war. It doesn't work. So isn't Saddam Hussein a big backer of the Palestinians? Yes and no. Technically, yes. In terms of rhetoric, yes. But at times, the Iraqi government assassinates some of the PLO's leadership. They are, in effect, trying to discipline them. So again, I could go on and on here, but the basic point is that you have a number of independent actors who are pursuing their own policies over the years, and they don't neatly fit into this Arab-Israeli, Jewish-Muslim paradigm that so many commentators in public seem to want to drive things into. Now, the story gets even more complicated. Even the story that I just told you is full of further nuance. The idea of being Palestinian, of having a sort of singular Palestinian identity and experience, it's more complicated than meets the eye. And we could say, well, okay, yes, being French, what does it mean to be French today? What does it mean to be Brazilian? Whatever. These things are also more complicated and they're also used. But the Palestinian context, the history of Palestinian national consciousness is enormously complicated. It doesn't follow a linear development as the kind of maybe abstracted model that people talk about for France or England. Before the 1960s, Palestinians don't really have a strong national voice. There isn't really a strong, specifically Palestinian organization. There are organizations that speak on behalf of Palestinians and political leaders that speak on behalf of Palestinians, but there isn't a national infrastructure. There isn't a national state. Palestinian national consciousness, we can start to talk about this emerging right around the turn of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century. Don't take my word for it. You can read the Palestinian historian Rashid Khalidi's book, Palestinian Identity, that gets into the roots of the emergence of Palestinian identity. But one of the complications is that you don't just have people becoming aware of, again, the sense of Palestinian identity. They also have other loyalties. They also have other identities. What's the difference between being Palestinian and being Arab? If you're talking about Palestinian, you're talking about people with a specific kind of consciousness tied to a very small stretch of land, which we would call Palestine, or Israel if you prefer. But how does that compare to the idea of being Arab, where you have these loyalties that are transnational? You have loyalties to people in Egypt, in Syria, and other parts of the Arabic world. What's the difference between being Palestinian and being Ottoman before 1914? You do have a state. You do have a political leader that you owe your loyalty to, but that loyalty is not established in the kind of classical national sense through the idea that you're part of the same political community defined by geography and culture and a shared sense of identity. How do all these things interact with each other? How does being Christian versus being Muslim affect the story? There are a very significant number of Palestinians who are Christians. So they're not part of the Muslim world, but they are part of the Arab world. They are Palestinian. How do you work through all these identities? In most cases, these identities get shaped in the 1920s and 30s in the Middle East in countries that are at least independent sovereign states. If you look at Jordan, if you look at Iraq, right? How do people grow up to basically become Jordanians? Well, they interact with the institutions of the Jordanian state. They pay taxes. They, in some cases, vote in elections. They serve in the army. They buy postage stamps. They're subject to the laws of the state of Jordan. Palestinians never really, and still to this day, have never really had that moment, have not had that structure around them to help shape an idea of collective identity. When the Ottoman Empire falls apart, the territory of Palestine is administered by the British. When the British decide to pull out, you have the UN partition. The Palestinians reject the partition. They lose the war that follows. And they're driven to basically being refugees in other Arab states. An incredibly large number of Palestinians have either grown up in the diaspora today or they live in the diaspora today. What does it mean to be Palestinian, but you're a citizen of Jordan? What does it mean to be a Palestinian and you live perhaps in Egypt, but you're not a citizen of Egypt? You live in a refugee camp. You may have certain rights. You might have like a permanent residency, but you're not a citizen of Egypt. You don't feel Egyptian. When you put all these different experiences together, you create a very different way of being, and in some cases thinking about being Palestinian. There is a huge difference between growing up stateless in a refugee camp in Gaza versus growing up in Amman with a Jordanian passport, or versus being a Palestinian who's living here in the United States, living in the UK. Today, being an Arab who lives within the pre-67 borders of Israel means that you can vote, that you have access to education, that you have access to at least a good job market, right? Not everybody has a good job. There is some economic inequality a little bit in Israel. We also have inequality here in the United States. But that is a vastly, vastly different experience than if you live in the West Bank, where you cannot vote in Israeli elections. You have limited mobility. You face restrictions on which roads you can use. This is a more recent historical development, but Palestinians today living in the West Bank cannot just cross into Israel if they want to. And again, we'll talk about this. It's a historical development. This was not the case after the war in 67. It's more recent than that. But the key point that I'm trying to make to you here is that being Palestinian is not a singular experience. And these variations matter in terms of understanding how people talk about the Palestinian experience in history. Critics of Israel tend to focus, for obvious reasons, on the West Bank and Gaza and the difficulties Palestinians experience there. Supporters of Israel will talk more about the experience of being an Arab inside the 67 frontiers, where, as I mentioned, life is much better. There's much more integration, and we'll get into that, I guess, as we go deeper in the podcast. It's worth pointing out, too, that politically, being Palestinian is incredibly complex. In the discourse today, I hear a number of people talking about Hamas and about Palestinians as if they are the same thing. And there is an enormous division within the Palestinian community between Hamas and Fatah. There's also other parties as well. They're not as important, or they're not as large. They have had some historical importance over time, and we'll talk about that especially in the 1960s when we talk about the issue of terrorism, or asymmetrical violence, or anti-colonial resistance, however you want to phrase it. But there are a number of debates between those two groups. One is more, Hamas is more religious, Fatah tends to be more secular. They also have very different ideas about what the solution is to the current state of affairs. In late 1988, the PLO accepted the premise of a two-state solution. Hamas, on the other hand, rejected this notion until at least 2017. In 2017, they don't quite say, we accept the two-state solution, we accept Israel's right to exist. What they do is they issue a revised charter, and they basically say, the new Palestine that we're fighting for doesn't have to be all of mandatory Palestine. It doesn't have to be all of what it once was. It can be the territories Israel occupied after 1967. Now, how much weight should we put into this document? That's a great question. One of the things that happens if we're talking about the new kind of Palestinian home, including all the lands from pre-1967, that means East Jerusalem becomes a part of it, and that means the Wailing Wall, the most holy site in Judaism, also becomes a part of this new Palestinian state, which theoretically Hamas could rule over. For the record, the Wailing Wall is also literally built right next to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is arguably the third holiest site in all of Islam. So its exclusion from a Palestinian state can also be seen as problematic. But we'll talk about the Temple Mount, the Wailing Wall, all of this. We'll talk about this more later. The point that I'm trying to make is that it is unlikely that the state of Israel will ever accept a solution where the Wailing Wall is inside of Palestine. And so how genuinely Hamas really wants a two-state solution, if you want to flip the coin around the other side, how genuinely does Benjamin Netanyahu really want a two-state solution? How much does he really want to see peace in the Middle East? I would argue that he doesn't. That a big part of Israeli policy for the last 2 decades has been trying to sabotage the notion of an independent Palestine. At any rate, obviously, Hamas is continuing these rocket attacks on Israeli cities. We have the October 7th attacks. It's hard for me to look at Hamas and take the idea that they really want to just live in peace side by side. It's hard for me to take that seriously. Some of you may disagree. Some of you may say, well, no, it's anti-colonial resistance. They're repressed. I understand that. I understand that point of argument. And indeed, that's part of the reason that I'm making this podcast again, is that I want people to be able to see the entire picture, the way that people perceive events, and how someone could come to perhaps a different conclusion than you draw about looking at this historical record. One last brief point about Hamas. Again, they do engage in charity work in Gaza. It is not only a terrorist organization, and I say terrorist organization because that's what the United States has designated them as. Again, you want to call it anti-colonial resistance. It's not really that different in some ways. There's an old saying, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, or maybe it's one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. You get the point. I would note, however, that Hamas has long embraced the idea of using violence, including against its Palestinian rivals. In 2006 to 2007, for example, Hamas and Fatah actually fought a civil war in Gaza. Palestinian on Palestinian violence. And this led to the death of about 600 Palestinians. Why are they fighting? A lot of it has to do with political control. There were elections. Fatah had some issues. So we'll talk about why people kind of soured on Fatah. But basically, Hamas won the elections. They ran on a campaign of kind of anti-corruption. And that's the last election that we had there. Of course, we had again this kind of civil war. The two sides, sometimes they try to get along, sometimes they don't get along at all. Now, we can also play this game on the Israeli side as well. Israel is supposed to be the Jewish state, right? The idea that any Jew can go to Israel if they want to. They'll always have a home. They'll always be protected. That's the foundational ethos of Zionism and of the Israeli state. What's it mean to be Jewish? What defines you as being Jewish? Is it that your mother was Jewish? Is it a cultural thing? Right? Your parents were Jewish, so therefore you're Jewish, even if you don't go to services, you don't believe in it, you don't speak or read Hebrew. You find this sometimes with other groups as well. You'll meet a lot of people that say, oh, I'm a Catholic. Have you ever been to church? No. But my heritage is Catholic, so therefore I will embrace that identity. There is a long-standing debate in Jewish history about what it means to be Jewish and how do we identify and what makes or qualifies someone as Jewish. And this is true of Israel today. There are people who would say, oh, I'm Jewish. I should be able to qualify for Israeli citizenship. And that's not the case. You don't just get in by saying, oh, I'm Jewish. In terms of politics, I talked about the complications of Palestinian politics. You also have this in Israel. You have, and you have had, for decades, going back to, again, the original sort of story of the origins of Israel, you have individuals and parties that have pushed what we can call a colonial or imperial attitude towards the Palestinian people. I'm summarizing here, but essentially these individuals would argue Jews needed their own national state to survive, and given the surrounding hostility of their Arab neighbors, the Israeli state has to take a muscular approach to the notion of survival. Anything that it needs to do in order to survive is, in their eyes, seen as legitimate. This means, and again has meant historically, incorporating as much land as possible into the Jewish state. Jewish state is not very big. The state of Israel is very small. There is a lot of Israeli policy that is predicated on the notion of vulnerability. Especially once we start talking about airplanes, if I only have 8 minutes from an Egyptian airbase into Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, that's not a lot of time to respond to a potential attack. Today, this kind of more imperial mindset probably means the full or mostly full colonization of the West Bank. West Bank, again, is the territory that Israel took from Jordan at the end of the 1967 Six-Day War. In recent days, I have even seen some Israeli politicians from the kind of far-right parties talking about the idea of expelling the Palestinians from Gaza and recolonizing it with Jewish settlers. Right? How do we solve this kind of security issue? What I would argue, if that's the solution, that's ethnic cleansing. Setting aside the fact that there's nowhere for these Palestinians to go, right, it becomes enormously problematic. But there are historically people that associate with Zionism, such as Vladimir Jabotinsky in the 1920s and 30s, who not only want to kind of drive the Arabs out of all of Palestine, they also wanted to annex Jordan as well. Israelis in this camp tend to deny or downplay the possibility of an independent Palestinian national state. And they tend to take a kind of maximalist position, again, to this question of security. They are not hesitant to use disproportionate amounts of violence against Palestinian resistance organizations, they would say terrorists, however you want to describe it. They're not entirely concerned, or they're not as concerned about the idea of the humanitarian cost as you would think the United States military might be. Members in this group tend to support significant restrictions on Palestinian civil liberties, especially in the occupied territories. As I said, the life of a Palestinian living in the West Bank right now is very difficult. Now, just to give you some names to attach to this, if you're less familiar with the history and the politics of the region, you could also put Benjamin Netanyahu in this group. You could put Ariel Sharon or Menachem Begin in this group. But there's a clear sense of the survival of Israel justifies, in many ways, the repression of Palestinians. However, the story is complicated. There is also a strong liberal or progressive element in Israeli society that rejects, and that has historically rejected, this kind of maximalist approach. There are and have been Israeli politicians who have advocated for a two-state solution, and who are deeply critical of some of the restrictions placed on Palestinians in the occupied territory. There are Israeli humanitarian groups, Israeli kind of civil rights groups that are deeply critical of the situation in the West Bank. The Israeli government itself, at times, has made, including actually, I think, under Sharon, maybe it was Netanyahu, but I think it was Sharon, but the Israeli government has made efforts to invest in the Palestinian community, in industrial development, in education. So again, these politics are complicated. If you want some names that you could kind of put into this category, at times some of them are more kind of in the middle, some of them even more in the maximalist category. But people like Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, Ehud Barak. As I said, though, the whole situation is very complicated. We can also talk about this in terms of just what it means to be Israeli. Sometimes I find people talking on social media about Israelis as being white and Palestinians as being peoples of color. Another way to put this is that Israelis are all kind of European. Sometimes, again, social media is not the best place to go for understanding and dialogue. Sometimes you see people, trying to rile people up, trying to be trolls even. They say, oh, well, all the Israelis should just go back to Europe. This is a very poorly, how do I put this? This is a poor way of understanding Israeli society because it is actually far, far more diverse than the stereotype that I think a lot of people have here in the United States. The reality is that over half the population in Israel today trace their roots to the Middle East and North Africa. They're known as Mizrahi Jews. And they come mostly to Israel around 1950 because they're fleeing persecution in Arab states after the founding of the State of Israel. These are, even though people would never use this term today, these are Arab Jews. We have Arab Christians. Most Arabs are Muslim, but we do have a significant number of Arab Christians. Guess what? There are also Arab Jews. This is more than half of the population of the State of Israel. There's no Europe for them to go back to because they're not from Europe. There are also more than 150,000 Ethiopian Jews who came mostly in a little bit the late 80s, but especially the early 90s. There are even a very small minority of Jews who come from India. Finally, there are over 1.5 million Arabs who are Israeli citizens, and another 500,000 who are permanent residents. Set aside for a moment the obvious cases where we do have some discrimination. We do have, especially in the West Bank, the image of repression, the lack of civil rights. There are also Arabs that live in Israel that are quite happy to be there. We're talking about members of kind of minority groups like the Bedouin or the Druze. You could also throw members of the LGBTQ community. Homosexuality is much more widely accepted in Israel than it is in especially Gaza. There's been some changes, some reforms in the West Bank, so there is more equality there. There is also some hostility to homosexuality in Israel from certain religious communities. It's not the Netherlands. But there are Arabs who are very happy to live in Israel, and there are many, many, quote unquote, peoples of color who are Israelis and who are Jewish. So again, just to kind of bring all this together, and I'm sorry if I'm spending too much time on this, but the basic point is that the politics, the history of the region, the key players, the terms, the populations they speak for, these are all incredibly complicated. And these complications have a tendency to be erased by the two dominant interpretive frameworks that are often used to understand what's going on in the region. The first of these frameworks that I want to address is the notion that the story of the foundation of Israel is the classic story of European colonialism. If you've been around a college campus these days, I'm certainly around a college campus, this is one of the narratives that you hear. This is one way that people are understanding the situation. And when they think about justice, they think about, okay, how do we redress the violence of colonialism? And so I'm going to unpack this notion. I'm going to summarize it, and then I'll unpack it in just a second. Before I do, I want to note the second major narrative that I have a problem with, which is the idea that what's happening in Israel today is solely the product of anti-Semitism, or better put, Jew hatred. Everybody in the Middle East is Semitic. So you say, oh, they're being anti-Semitic. That doesn't really make any sense. As we're going to talk about, the State of Israel, the Zionist movement, they have made choices that have contributed or even provoked the situation. We're going to unpack all that. So, if you're sitting here saying, well, what are you going to say about the other side? Give me a chance. I'll get to it. Again, I'm trying to present both views. I have to present one first, and then I'll do the second one. So let's start with this notion of what I'll call the anti-colonial narrative. You can call it the colonial narrative, whatever. I like to use the word anti-colonial in the sense that the people espousing the narrative are pushing back on colonialism. So in this framing of things, the founding of the State of Israel in 1948 essentially marks the last major episode of classic European imperialism. Like other colonial settler states, the founding of Israel in this telling involves the appropriation of indigenous peoples' land. And this appropriation, this theft, is driven by a racist Zionist ideology that views the local Arab population as backward, or even worse, that kind of doesn't see them. To give you a kind of parallel, if you look at colonial maps of the United States, they tend not to put the Native Americans on the map. They tend to depict the West as this big, vast, open space that is just waiting for people to come and settle it. This process, these silences, ignore or erase Native American communities, Native American people, Native American political states, which did exist. Maybe not in the European sense, but there is a kind of political organization. And so as a result, again, in the anti-colonial narrative, the modern state of Israel is illegitimate. The wars that have occurred since 1948 can best be explained as Israeli aggression and a desire for expansion and conquest. Moreover, they would argue, through the conquest of the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights, Israel has subsequently established an apartheid regime that precludes the possibility of any two-state solution. And that word, apartheid, is a word that they use very specifically, very intentionally, as a way of equating Israeli society today with South African society from basically before 1994. They would argue that this apartheid regime has basically precluded any notion of a two-state solution. So instead, they have a kind of range of solutions. The most kind of benign is the idea that Israel as a Jewish state should be liquidated. So we're not talking about the people. We're talking just about the formal government, if you will, of the Israeli state. And it should be replaced by a multi-ethnic democracy where most Jews could remain as kind of a protected minority. So when we're founding this state, it's not that we're kicking anybody out. The Jews that are there can stay. They can practice their religion. They can have civil rights. The reason they would become a minority is that the new democratic state would allow Palestinians in the diaspora to return, and this would then make it a kind of Arab majority country again. And again, in this telling, you're not creating something new. You're restoring what had been. You're undoing the injustice of the first half of the 20th century. Now, there are a variety of opinions, a variety of ways of expressing solutions to the anti-colonial narrative, and those include darker visions of this idea that say, well, only Jews who can trace their ancestry back to pre-1917 Palestine, to before the Balfour Declaration, only those Jews should be able to stay. In the name of justice, the rest of the Jews have to, quote unquote, go home, go back to where they're from, which is nominally Europe. Right? They're not expecting hundreds of thousands of Jews to go back to Yemen. You can imagine how that would be received in places like Yemen or Iraq or Algeria. Right? Some countries might be more open to it, Morocco, maybe Egypt. But I think the bottom line is here, you're talking about the displacement of millions of people. And as we saw in 1948, displacing lots of people doesn't necessarily solve problems. It actually sows new ones. Now, before we get into some of the problems with the anti-colonial narrative, I'm going to say something that might surprise some of you. Certain parts of the story that I just outlined are in fact true. The story of the foundation of the State of Israel, including the 1948 kind of civil war that plays out, it does involve the mass migrations of millions of Jews to the region that we now call Palestine. This did result in the displacement of significant numbers of local inhabitants even before 1948. Now, we should also point out that there are Jews living in the State of Israel, in Palestine, whatever you want to call it, for over 5,000 years. That doesn't negate the fact, however, that the displacement is real. One can find terrible quotes from some of the most important players in the construction of the Yishuv, or the Jewish community of Palestine, before 1948, who not only talk about colonizing the land, but some, like Jabotinsky, speak explicitly about what we would call ethnic cleansing today. Now, we do want to situate this in its historical context, and sometimes that doesn't happen. People talking about colonization in the 1920s, it's not exactly the same thing as what they're talking about when they refer to it today. There's overlap, don't get me wrong. Colonization is not necessarily just a benign process. That's the whole reason people talk about it today. But their self-understanding of the project of what they're engaged in does not necessarily mean the same thing to them that it does to you today. We also want to be careful about pulling quotes from different contexts. A quote from someone in the 1940s, as the kind of tendency is to move towards a sort of civil war in Palestine, is different than what he was thinking in the 1920s. People evolve over time. People talk about things differently than they once did. People here in the United States have a very, very different opinion today of the second Gulf War, the second war with Iraq, than they did back in 2003, 2004. So we want to be careful to place things in their historical context. Continuing along, again, the part of this anti-colonial narrative that is true. After 1948, the Israeli state does confiscate the land of Palestinians who understandably fled in the middle of the war. They allow a very, very, very small minority to come back. Belatedly, they come up with a kind of compensation plan for this land, which is designated as abandoned and then sold or given to Jewish settlers. But this is a very minor amount of compensation. It is not really a serious attempt at justice, I would argue. Again, after its founding, the State of Israel has at times taken an aggressive approach towards its neighbors. It has annexed and settled significant parts of the West Bank. So it hasn't annexed the entire West Bank, but it has annexed portions of it. Now, these repressions, the settlement, all these things going on, they aren't just happening. It's not just Israelis wake up one day and say, oh, let's repress the Palestinians. There's a long history, as we'll talk about, of violence. We want to talk about why there are so many strong restrictions on Palestinian movement in the West Bank. You have to talk about suicide bombing and the Second Intifada. It doesn't justify them necessarily, but it's part of understanding, again, how we got here. Finally, one could argue the current situation in both Gaza and the West Bank is untenable. And that's not just because, oh, well, Palestinians happen to find themselves here. It's partly because Israel has taken restrictive actions, or at least the government of Israel has, and that has worked against the idea of a two-state solution. But, and again, but in really, really, really huge letters, this is not the entire story. The narrative, or this narrative, conveniently happens to leave out some crucial aspects of the story that help put the actions of Jews and Israelis into a wider context. Now, I'm not going to spend, I say too much time. I'm not going to go and talk about everything right now in terms of details because I want to address them in subsequent episodes. But one of the most fundamental problems with the anti-colonial narrative is that it ascribes to the Zionists a position of power before 1948 that is simply not reflected in reality. At no time before 1948 did Jews in Palestine possess any legal or political authority over the Arab population. When the process of Jewish migration began in the late 19th century, what we call Palestine, or what you want to call Israel today if you prefer, this territory was ruled over by the Ottoman Turks. They maintained control of the territory until the end of World War I, when political authority was transferred to the British by the League of Nations. And while it's true that some members of the British government, including people like Winston Churchill, were quite favorable to the idea of the Zionist project, and of course, most famously, the UK issues the Balfour Declaration in 1917, committing it to establishing a Jewish state in 1917, it is equally true that the British made promises to both the Arabs and to some extent the French about the future of this territory. And again, just to connect this to something we talked about earlier in the podcast, it isn't a clear sense of just, well, Palestinians are Palestinians. But there is a strong sense of Arab identification. And so as the British are kind of thinking about what the post-war world order might look like, when they make an offer to Arabs about independence, some of them are thinking this also includes the Palestinian people. Now, we mentioned Britain. Britain is not there because they care about Israelis and Zionism. They're not there because they care about Palestinians or Arabs. Britain is interested in setting up the mandate because it wants to pursue its own interests, and in particular, that means protecting the Suez Canal. right? World War I, the Ottoman Turks launched several attempts to kind of take the canal. The canal connects India to Britain. It's the lifeblood of the British Empire. And so the idea is let's go into Palestine. Let's kind of control it either directly or indirectly. And in doing so, we'll be able to protect the autonomy of the Suez Canal. Later on, of course, they decide that it's about oil. In the anti-colonialist narrative, if you read scholars who adopt this approach, people like, again, Rashid Khalidi, they describe the Zionist movement as a British protege. The only way that you can really get this sense of Zionism as a British protege, the British are, sitting there in their imperial garb and they're kind of saying, okay, Zionists, this is how you're going to be able to do what we did in the territory of Palestine. The only way that you can get there is if you ignore the considerable amount of evidence that there are many members of the British government who are very hostile to the idea of Zionism. Most of their hostility, by the way, does not come from the fact that, well, they love Arabs, they love Palestinians, they're potentially anti-colonial nationalists. No, they're sitting there going, we want to maintain the control of this territory. If we bring in lots of Jews, this is going to piss off the Arabs. We want their support. And as I said later on, Britain says, well, we actually want friendly relations with the Arab countries because we want access to their oil. In the 1930s, some Jewish groups that we'll talk about later in the podcast not only are opposed to the British and quarrel with the British, they actually turn to terrorism against the British. They assassinate important British figures in the region. They blow up the King David Hotel, which was the headquarters of the British sort of occupation or the mandate government. And so again, because the two groups have very different purposes, especially in the 1930s, the British are incredibly hostile to Zionism. The British try to stop Jewish immigration into Palestine in the 1930s as the Nazis are trying to kick all the Jews out of Germany. So these Jewish resistance groups, if you want to call them that, Jewish terrorists, whatever, they are smuggling Jews into Palestine. They are smuggling weapons into Palestine. The British at one point actually set up an internment camp in Cyprus. They put thousands and thousands of Jewish refugees in these internment camps. That doesn't sound like a protege to me. So again, just to emphasize, the issue is not that the colonial narrative is based upon lies or misrepresentations or that it has no value. The problem is that it selectively chooses, or it can selectively choose, facts to create a particular narrative of victimization that again leaves out important context. Another way that we can see problems with this narrative is to look at how that land that initially formed the Yishuv was acquired. Now, in the classical example of European colonialism, places like Algeria or Vietnam, or to some extent India, this land is either taken through direct force, or more commonly, the colonial governments basically declare it to be unclaimed, and they sell it or give it to Europeans. It is very much like the process we're going to talk about in a second that comes not from Zionists, it comes from the Ottoman government. So, in the case of Palestine, most of the land acquired by Jewish migrants was not taken from Arabs. It is purchased from them at market prices. It is not seized. It is not wrested from them by the Zionists. You could argue that the moment of colonization or the moment of dispossession, at least before 1948, and that's a key distinction, that happens under the Ottomans because of something called the 1858 Ottoman Land Code. Basically, what this code is, and we'll talk about it more in our next podcast episode when we talk about the pre-1917 era, but basically, the Ottoman Land Code is an effort to modernize, it's an effort to organize and rationalize land ownership, and it allows people to take claim over land that previously either belonged to the state or was just kind of communal land. So you're living in a small village in Galilee, you have goats, you have sheep, whatever, you're allowing them to farm. You're not tied up in the idea that this is my farm, that's your farm, this is my territory. The community kind of uses the land collectively. What basically happens after 1858 is that someone can go and claim and register that land in their name and take ownership of it. Most of the families that are using these lands after 1858, the local inhabitants, if you will, the indigenous population, they are not interested in registering the land. One, they're farmers. They're not, skilled in the arts of Ottoman bureaucracy. And two, they're worried about taxation. Why is the government going to associate my name with this land? Well, it's probably because they're going to try to make me pay money for that. And so instead, what happens is you have a variety of tax collectors, educated elites, and other entrepreneurs who move in over the course of the kind of middle of the 19th century, the sort of middle third or middle quarter, I guess, third quarter of the 19th century, who take ownership of land that they're not actually working. These are merchants from cities like Beirut or Damascus or Jaffa or Haifa or Gaza. These are Arabs who are taking control of this land. So when the Jewish migrations start, when there is a desire for land, the Zionists don't just show up with guns and take it. They buy it from local Arabs, including many of these Arabs that are, again, residents of cities that have no real connection to the land, but have registered it and taken it through a kind of bureaucratic imperialism, if you want to call it that. This purchasing of land actually drives a robust market. These Arab merchants will benefit from it. Some of them do quite handsomely. Part of the problem, though, is that they're Arabs. They're not necessarily Palestinians, or they're not thinking of themselves in those terms. They're certainly not very concerned about those local farmers. In fact, some of the people that buy this land are Arabs, and they don't sell it to the Jews. But in all these cases, the local indigenous farmers start to be driven off the purchased lands. It's not hard in retrospect to feel sympathy for these Arab or for these Palestinian farmers' plight. It's not hard to say they didn't do anything wrong. Why was their land taken from them? It certainly wasn't justice that they were driven off their own lands. But were they victims of Zionism or of modernity? The way that millions of other people in North America, in Germany, in other countries are driven off their lands by rationalization and capitalism over the course of the 19th century. If we're going to talk about this as a process of theft, aren't the Arab families who claimed and profit and sell those lands under Ottoman law, aren't they kind of the actual thieves in the story? Don't the Ottomans bear at least some responsibility for creating this system? Now, again, if you drill down into the history, and we'll talk about this more in the next episode, when you talk about a particular wave of migration called the Second Aliyah, which is about 1904 to 1914, 1917, depending on how you want to date it, there is a process of Jews driving Arabs off the land, right? So the Jews buy the land in some cases. They have Arabs that work for them. The Second Aliyah will focus more on the idea of Jews working, and we'll talk about why that is later. But they will say, we only want Jewish farmers. We only want Jewish laborers. And so again, it's not that the anti-colonial narrative is full of lies and deceit and distortions. There's a lot of truth to what goes on. It's very easy to understand why someone could adopt that perspective. But it's not the entire story. Finally, we should also point out that while we're talking about this Ottoman land code and the seizure of peasant lands and all of this is very bad, it's worth noting that a sizable minority of the land that's sold, according to one contemporary, this is actually about 40% of the land, it does come from people who are actually working the land. It does come from poor farmers who say, okay, I'm farming, it's a tough life, I don't really have a lot of economic or even social mobility. Oh, here comes these people that are going to buy my land and give me money, and maybe I'll start a business, maybe I'll move, maybe I'll, do something with the money. It seems a bit problematic to me that in retrospect, historically, we're going to go back and judge those farmers who sold their land to Jews or to Jewish institutions and accuse them of treason or betrayal or of being kind of agents of colonialism because they made decisions about their own land. It's their choice. In fact, I mentioned that there's this kind of tendency to go back and kind of retroactively accuse them of kind of a version of treason. It's not just in a contemporary way that this happens. If you go back and you read the local newspapers from the period, you can find plenty of examples of Palestinian nationalists. Again, there's not many of them around 1910, but there are some. They are literate. They are starting journals. They are trying to raise awareness. These newspapers extort their rural brethren. Do not sell land to Jews. They specifically go around to the rural villages and try to distribute the newspapers in order to awaken those who live there of the quote-unquote national danger of selling their land. This is happening because ordinary local farmers are selling their land. Now, we should also note that this is not a particularly Palestinian phenomenon. We'll talk in our next episode about efforts that Zionists are making to try to convince Jews all around the world of a need to have specifically a kind of nationalist Jewish consciousness as opposed to just a religious one. If you go and look at the history of Eastern and Central Europe in the 19th century, right into the 20th century, the same time period, there are all these people living in rural areas that don't really care about the national conflict. They don't feel German or Czech. They speak both languages. And the nationalists come from the cities and start to say, you need to feel Czech. You need to be German. Stop drinking that Czech beer. The choice you make about beer is all about the battle for the soul of the nation. You need to conform to the ways that we believe. This is part of the story of modernity, of the transition to a kind of modern, national-centered world. This story has real losers. It has people that suffer because of the outcomes that happen. So you can make a kind of anti-colonial argument, but you need to also situate that in the larger history, and especially to put it against the backdrop of a transition to modernity, because that plays such a fundamental role in the story. It is not the story of big bad Jews show up in their gunboats and just take the land from the Palestinians. There's much more going on here. Another way that we can view this story or tell this story is to think of it not as anti-colonialism, but to think of it as a refugee story. The initial wave of Jews who come to Palestine do not come in the name of conquest or of exploiting the local population or of kind of, looking for gold or rubber or kind of other colonial goods. They're not there to make a fortune, and in fact, most of them are incredibly poor. Most of them are refugees fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. These poor Jews are not welcomed in most parts of the world. Right? Some of them do make it to the United States. My great-great-grandfather came from Russia. He got here by basically being a stowaway on a ship. For the ones that do get to migrate to places like France or England, they are met with incredible hostility. Go and look, for example, at the conversations going on in public, at the newspaper articles surrounding the Jack the Ripper case. There is a lot of speculation at the time that Jack the Ripper must be Jewish, because we have all these poor immigrants coming in, and of course, poverty and crime must go together. We can't conceive of a world where poor people don't commit crime, right? Which is, of course, ridiculous. It's a stereotype. Even in the United States, we do have significant Jewish immigration, and we see a negative reaction to that. So the initial waves of people coming to Palestine are refugees looking for a place to call home. In the 1930s, Jewish immigration to Palestine continues or accelerates, driven obviously by a combination of Nazi persecution, and just as importantly, the fact that the rest of the world, with one or two exceptions, closes their doors to Jewish refugees, especially poor Jewish refugees. Albert Einstein wants to come to the United States, no problem. the poor tailor, especially, the farther you go in the process, poor cobbler, poor farmer. No, we don't want that. This aspect of the story of the rest of the world being closed to Jewish immigration is one of the strongest arguments Zionists make for the necessity of founding an independent state of Israel. There is nowhere else for them to go. You can go back, by the way, and look at Palestinians talking about in the moment, in 1900, in 1910, talking about this moment, saying, we love Jews, we respect Jews, we think the Jewish community is great. Just find another place to settle. We don't want you destroying Palestine. We get that opinion. That makes sense. I get that perspective. But the people coming are refugees. The next large wave of migrants to Israel comes around again 1950. These are not people coming because, now we can take this territory, we get free stuff, we're freeloaders. They come from across the Middle East and North Africa because they are, again, refugees. They are, again, fleeing persecution. Jews in some countries like Yemen are not widely accepted, right? They might be tolerated, but they certainly don't experience equality. They live in a ghetto. They have to be back in the ghetto before sunset. And of course, the founding of the State of Israel in 1948 makes everything even more complicated. Finally, the last wave of major migrations to Israel happens in the 1980s and 1990s. I mentioned the Ethiopian Jews being one of them. We should also note that there are large numbers of Russian Jews that come. And why do they come? Because they're fleeing persecution in the Soviet Union, or Russia later. None of these elements that I've just described of the refugee story excuses the problematic elements that are highlighted by the colonial narrative. I'm not trying to say that it's legitimate to drive people off of their land. However, we need to understand that the Jewish colonists that are coming are also not there just to drive people off their land. There is a broader context here that needs, in my opinion, to be put into, or at least recognized alongside, the anti-colonial narrative. I had a colleague tell me the other day that the story of Israel, Palestine, is that the victims became the victimizers. I would argue that basically both Israelis or Jews and Palestinians are victims. And that doesn't justify or excuse the excesses of one group or the other. It's just trying to understand better how we got here. Okay, so if I haven't managed to get your blood boiling yet, let's change gears and problematize the other big narrative out there, which again is this idea that the problems in the Middle East are just driven by anti-Semitism, or as we said, more accurately would be described as just Jew hatred. In this narrative, the foundation of the State of Israel is a heroic act. I just mentioned all the stuff about it's a refugee story. It's very easy to think about refugees fleeing persecution, having very little, building a state, building a society, creating a nation. So again, in this narrative, the foundation of the State of Israel is a heroic act, the product of a people long discriminated against who migrated to a sparsely populated land where against all odds they built a thriving democracy and brought prosperity to the inhabitants of the region, Jewish and Arab alike. In this telling, the story of Israel starting in 1948 is one of grit and pluckiness. It's the story of triumph over the constant jealousies of Israel's neighbors and the irrational hatred of Jews, fostered primarily by certain Muslim groups, especially groups like Hamas. Again, as we saw in the colonial narrative, there are elements of this story that are absolutely true. As we just mentioned, the waves of Jews who come to Palestine are, for the most part, not comparable to the wealthy settler colonists from Europe who relocate to Algeria, Vietnam, India, Kenya. They're not sitting around plantations being served on by the natives. Most of them are instead refugees. The land that they come to inhabit is not this land of plenty, and I know it's referred to as milk and honey in the Bible. It's not this plush land that they're getting in most instances. It's hard. It's difficult. There are a lot of things like swamps and deserts that have to be overcome. And so this element of the kind of heroic narrative, again, there is a lot to be kind of impressed with. Today, the second largest city in Israel is Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is basically a community built by Jewish settlers. We should also note that when we're talking about anti-Semitism or Jew hatred, there has been Jew hatred in the Middle East. It's there. I'm not saying everyone feels it, everyone identifies with it. Most people I've met with are actually quite nice, and it's not, again, there's certainly nothing in Islam about being anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. A lot of it's based on politics. But it does exist. It is there. Now, and especially historically. It's not, by the way, just a kind of native anti-Semitism. One of the kind of ways that anti-Semitism, or again, Jew hatred, gets pushed in the Middle East is that the Nazis in the 1930s figure out, well, we want to disrupt the British, we want to interfere with British colonies. What better way to do that than to push anti-Semitism and to inflame the region? Hamas, as I discussed earlier, is not your friendly neighborhood resistance movement. If you read their initial charter from the late 1980s, Article 22 accuses Jews of being behind, among other things, the French Revolution, communism, Freemasonry, both world wars, and all in the name of making money and manipulating the local inhabitants. That narrative that Jews are behind all wars and do it just for money and to manipulate the little people is a narrative that was part and parcel not only of National Socialism, but it goes back to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a forgery produced by the Tsarist government at the beginning of the 20th century. Article 28 of the Hamas Charter ends by stating, quote, "We should not forget to remind every Muslim that when the Jews conquered the Holy City in 1967, they stood on the threshold of the Aqsa Mosque and proclaimed that Muhammad is dead and his descendants are all women." I don't know if that happened or not. It seems kind of Monty Python-esque. But the intent is clear, right? The intent is to say, Jews hate you, Jews have marginalized you, Jews have offended you, rally behind us for resistance. The document ends, by the way, by saying, Israel, Judaism, and Jews challenge Islam and the Muslim people. May the cowards never sleep. Now, maybe you want to argue 2017, Hamas is trying to move in a different direction. Maybe you want to argue that they're more open to the idea of a two-state solution. Perhaps. But this stuff was there historically, and it's still circulating in places today. Doesn't, again, mean that most people believe in it. Doesn't mean that all Muslims believe in it, all Arabs believe in it. Clearly, we have in the United States groups that we would describe as racist, like the KKK, neo-Nazis. They distribute all kinds of anti-Muslim propaganda. Doesn't mean that all or most people believe it, but it's there. But, and again, triple but. This is not the entire story of the foundation of the State of Israel. We obviously mentioned a moment ago that during the initial wave of Jewish migration to the region, again, Arab farmers are driven off the land. In the 1920s and 30s, there were a number of riots and acts of violence initiated really by both sides, but this means both sides. There are Jewish defense organizations that try to get a little preemptive at times and that affect violence on Palestinians. When the civil war over the Mandate breaks out in late 1947, there are some acts of what we would call ethnic cleansing. Many Palestinians who understandably flee the fighting had their land confiscated afterwards due to it being designated by the State of Israel as abandoned. This is not some objective, let's sit around in a room and talk about what should be the legal definition of abandonment. It is seizing people's land. Israel has launched preemptive strikes against its neighbors, and there are examples of Israeli massacres of Arab civilians in the 20th century. It has happened. Doesn't mean it's all Israelis or most Israelis or It's what should happen. In fact, in one case when it happened, the Israelis involved of the IDF were prosecuted. But it's there. Several Israeli governments, including the Netanyahu regime, have sought to sabotage the peace process and the potential for a two-state solution, especially through settlement of the West Bank. And again, my point here is not to delegitimate the right of the Israeli state to exist or to deny the role that Jew hatred has played in fomenting attacks against Israelis. Obviously, if you look what happened on October 7th, that's not a military operation. They're not raping women because it helps them secure more territory or it prevents against other, Israeli attacks. There is a lot of anger. There is a lot of hatred, and it is fueled by Jew hatred. But I'm trying to show you that the kind of Disneyfied narrative of Zionism that many of us grew up with is also based on a selective presentation of the history of the region, one that most importantly tends to minimize the experience or leave out altogether the experience of the Arab or Palestinian population of the region. These things, these experiences, even if you want to argue that they're deserved, they happen. The idea of Palestinian resistance, I'm not trying to justify the violence, but there's a reason for it. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not just people being irrational. And I don't see how we get to peace unless we start to recognize the suffering in the experience of the quote-unquote other side. Whether this means looking at those initial Zionists coming to what becomes the state of Israel as refugees and thinking about their experiences, or whether it means thinking about the displaced Arab population, which you have to kind of consider both sides if you want reconciliation. Now, the history of this region is complicated. And I would argue if we were going to try to drill it down to one fundamental of what is the fundamental of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I would say that fundamental is violence. And we'll see this borne out in episodes that follow. But if I could extend a critique made by, again, Khalidi about the Second Intifada, which focused heavily on the idea of suicide bombings, there is a distinct pattern since 1948 of Palestinian resistance violence, Palestinian kind of, again, resistance to what's going on being expressed through violence, and it has a tendency to bring out the worst aspects of Zionism or Zionist groups. Violence, I would say, is not a solution to the situation. Quite the opposite, as I've tried to argue here and show a little bit just in this introductory episode. The more people use violence, the more it has the tendency to drive the two groups apart and to sustain notions of conflict. You'd think that after 70 years, people would realize this, but I sense that today there's sadly more enthusiasm for the idea of violence as a solution or as a tool to create a political solution than there has been at any other point in my lifetime. Okay, I've been going on for a little while here, so I'm going to try to make a number of other key observations, maybe not so polemical, but try to do it maybe a little bit more quickly. First off, I think one of the other key fundamentals underwriting the conflict that doesn't get discussed enough is that since the dawn of Palestinian nationalism, really at the tail end of the 19th century, Palestinians have never really had control over their own destiny. Even today, they lack a clear national future. There was a moment in the 1990s, there was hope that, maybe the Oslo Accords would create in the West Bank a kind of path towards statehood. People talk about a Palestinian state today. There obviously is, some sort of governmental structure, but it's not really a state. It doesn't have full sovereignty, full control over its borders. It doesn't have the ability to make decisions independently of Israel. And again, this is something that is historically constant. Before 1918, Palestinians were in essence colonial subjects of the Ottoman Empire. We talked about the Ottoman Land Code and how devastating that was for people living in Palestine, Arabs living in Palestine in particular. Those are decisions being made on the behest of the Ottoman Empire, who is making decisions for Palestinians. Now, there is, at times a kind of Ottoman parliament. There are elected delegates to it. It's not really changing the situation in dramatic ways. After 1918, Palestinians are the subjects of the British Empire through the League of Nations mandate. Then after 1948, they're a stateless people in the wilderness, largely strewn across the Middle East and North Africa, sometimes living in refugee camps. And although you have various Arab states that claim to be their champions, in reality, Arab leaders like Nasser or King Hussein of Jordan use the Palestinians as a political tool to pursue their own ends. They're not doing it because deep down inside, they want to be the champions of the Palestinian people and help them, and they care about them. They do it just as the British were involved in governing, out of a sense of self-interest and what can they use the situation for. Think about this for a second. Many of the lands that Palestinians currently aspire to build a new state on, Gaza and the West Bank, were controlled by Egypt and Jordan after 1948 until 1967. Why, for 2 decades, was there not an attempt to build a Palestinian state out of those lands when you had what were theoretically more friendly Arab regimes controlling them? And then, of course, 1967 happens, and these lands are occupied by Israel, and the political leadership of the Palestinian people, the PLO, is kind of forced to move around. They're based in Jordan for a while, then Lebanon, then Tunis. And even after, as I said, the start of the peace talks in the 1990s, the result is not a unified state, but a kind of sliced up, not quite fully autonomous statelet that has no real practical hope of future statehood, at least not in the immediate future. It's hard in these circumstances not to feel a great degree of sympathy for the Palestinian people. A huge part of the problem is that Palestinians not only do not have today, but they have never had a national future, at least not a clear national future, a clear way for them to control their own destiny. And so I'd argue that the only way that we can get out of the violent situation, the cycle of violence that we see over and over and over again, is to establish a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. Now, at the same time, I think it's important to note that while Palestinians have not controlled their own destiny, this does not mean that they have had no influence over it. Quite the opposite. The history of Palestinian political leadership is one long story of poor choices and worse consequences. There were moments in the early 1920s when the British are first setting up the mandate, and they explore the formation of a multi-ethnic political body that could have served as the framework for governing a multicultural or multi-ethnic Palestine. Arab authorities in the early 1920s reject the idea of participating in these councils or in these structures because it would have given or acknowledged for Jews a political role. It would have given them some power, and that was a bridge too far. As the world moved to war in the late 1930s, the leading Palestinian political figure, a guy named Haj Amin, who is the Mufti of Jerusalem, throws his lot in with Nazi Germany, even recruiting Muslims to fight for the Germans, and even traveling to Europe in 1941 to personally meet with Hitler and Mussolini in order to secure their blessings as the future leader of the Arab world. Don't believe me? Google it. You can see the pictures of Hitler and the Mufti together. It is not surprising that after the war, as the British kind of return and sort of start setting up whatever's going to happen with the mandate, it's not surprising that they are hostile to the Mufti and his kind of group and their efforts to take over Palestine. There are Arabs, by the way, that also fight for the British. And we'll talk about that later. There are Jewish companies of soldiers that are set up to fight for the British, and we'll get into all that when we talk about World War II. Again, returning to this story of just kind of bad judgments, mistakes over time, you have the 1948 partition by the UN. And we'll talk about the 1948 partition, why it does what it does. Some of you might say, well, it was deeply unfair. It was awful. It was kind of legitimizing colonialism. Fine, you have your opinion. That's fine. You're entitled to it. I think the reality that we have to agree on is that it hasn't worked out well in the 70 years since. Had Palestinians accepted the UN partition, there would not only be a Palestine today, an independent sovereign nation today, its capital would be Jerusalem. And it would have sovereignty over the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is one of the biggest reasons that the peace process has broken down, especially in the late 1990s. For Palestinians, how do you have a nation state that does not have Jerusalem as its capital, given how important it is to Muslims and Christians? For Jews, how do you have, this territory, how do you relinquish it if it also has the Wailing Wall, right, as part of the complex? We could also get into the 1990s. At least so far in my reading of it, it's difficult to tell. Kind of each side blames the other one. It's a little bit of a he said disagreement. But again, I think the point is that a lot of the Palestinian national resistance movements have failed to really move the needle by demanding initially the idea before 1967 of not having an Israel. Since the 1980s, obviously we talked about the PLO has recognized the idea for a two-state solution, but you also have a series of violent episodes of resistance, which, again, regardless of whether or not they're legitimate, I don't know that they've worked. The First Intifada, yes, you can make that argument. It actually had some real political consequences, generated enormous sympathy for the Palestinian people. But I don't think that other episodes of violence have been that useful. Think about something like these rockets that Hamas has amassed that they love to shoot at Israel. They shoot at kibbutzes, they shoot it at cities. What's the military value in that? What's been achieved by doing that? Even if you want to talk about something like the October 7th attacks, what was accomplished? Has Hamas offered more resistance to Israel than before? Did they take more territory? Have they prevented Gaza from being overrun? They took hostages. What's the point of keeping these hostages today? Does it really, has it improved the lot of Palestinians? Are they better off today than they were on October 6th? There's a whole history of episodes, maybe not on that scale, but a whole history of episodes going back to the 1960s of episodes of anti-colonial violence. We're talking about some bombings, especially if you grew up in the 1970s or 80s, you were very aware of the hijackings that happened, kidnappings, the Munich Olympic attacks in 1972, suicide bombings during the Second Intifada, and again, all these rocket attacks. These strategies of violence have not weakened Israeli morale. They have not, one could argue, advanced the Palestinian national cause. Ask yourself, were Palestinians in a better position in 1949 or 1966 or today? This use of violence again tends to provoke reciprocal and often disproportionate amounts of violence from the Israeli side, and it has hardened divisions between the two people and led to massive suffering by Palestinians. So again, anti-colonial violence is not only bad from a moral perspective, in my opinion. The more important point is that it doesn't work. It often leads to mass suffering, especially of the people that it is supposed to free. There are some examples one could point to where you could say, well, anti-colonial violent movements in Indonesia, in Algeria, in Vietnam, those actually worked out. And yes, after massive amounts of suffering, you can make the argument that they quote unquote worked out. But what has been the legacy of other states, legacy of civil war, of violence? Algeria in the 1960s, emerging from the Algerian War of Independence, was not this wonderful place where just everybody got along and everything worked perfectly, and it was just Shangri-La after that. There were more revolutions, there was more violence, there was economic issues, there was another civil war in the 1990s. And now millions of people of Algerian descent live in France. It seems to me sometimes that the real appeal of anti-colonial violence is not that it is successful, but that it makes the people exercising the violence feel more powerful, feel like they have agency, feel like they have control over a situation. Why are people cheering in the streets of Gaza on October 7th and October 8th? It's not because Hamas secured them a better future or realized some goal that had long been dreamed of. It's because for once, Palestinians living there felt like they had some control. Like Israelis were the ones that were on the other end of the stick, so to speak. So just to conclude the thought, as a historian, I would say if you're interested in anti-colonialism, a far better strategy is nonviolent protest and boycott. I mentioned the success of the First Intifada. You could also talk about Martin Luther King Jr. You could talk about Gandhi. There's other ways to get to what you want that don't involve violence. I said I was going to talk more quickly, and clearly here I am. We're still going. So let me try to, again, get through just a little bit more. I want to point out a more troubling aspect with the theoretical lens of analysis that's become an increasingly popular way of understanding not just this context, right, Israel-Palestine, but that's a way of approaching the world itself and an attempt to kind of understand conflict, suffering, violence. How did we get where we are? And this is the notion that the best way to view the world is in terms of structures. Now, there's a lot of value to the structural approach to the world. There's a lot of value that scholars have given us, especially those involved in what we might call post-colonialism, ways of reevaluating narratives, reevaluating how we approach things, reevaluating ideas of bias, and especially ideas of power and the structures that power flow through. So there is a lot of good things that are out there about structure and theory. However, there are also ways that this becomes somewhat dehumanizing. When we kind of frame the situation in the Middle East as a relationship of oppressor versus oppressed, colonizer versus colonized subject, white versus people of color, there are, again, elements of the narrative that fit that, and there are insights that we can gain by looking at things from those standpoints. But in an unintended irony, there is a tendency to dehumanize some of the people that you're talking about. When you start talking about colonizer versus colonized, or you start using words like settler colonists, what you are doing is reading out the individuality, and I would argue the humanity, of those people and of their particular points of view and how they feel about their neighbors and their relationship and their governments. And you kind of abstract them all and lump them all into a singular category that then can look like whatever you want it to look like. So calling Jewish migrants from the 1920s or 30s Zionists or settler colonists is a way, maybe not intentionally, but it's a way to ignore the fact that many of these people, as I've said, were refugees fleeing oppression who have literally nowhere else to go. It also erases moderate or alternative voices who may have wanted to reach a different political outcome with the Arab population. You can see this to some extent in the kind of Jew hate narrative. Right? When people talk about Muslims as being a singular category and talk about the Muslim approach towards Jews and understanding of Jews as a singular collective feeling, you are abstracting them and reading out lots of different takes on it and lots of different understandings. There are assholes in every different religious group, ethnic group, national group, gender, whatever. There are assholes out there that are anti-Jewish. There are people that are anti-Muslim. They don't speak for the whole community. But when we fall into these kind of collective ways of thinking about things, and that's all we think about, we dehumanize them. You see this to some extent in some of the reactions here in the United States to the October 7th attacks. I have seen some commentators, and again, this is sometimes people on social media, so Again, not the best place for polite discourse, but you see people that try to justify or dismiss these attacks on Israeli civilians by saying, well, these were settler colonists. They shouldn't have been there in the first place. Anti-colonial violence is legitimate and justified. And so if some people die along the way, too bad. You can make an argument for the legitimate use of violence in resistance against oppression when the target is a military installation, when you're talking about government structures. I wouldn't say this about the American police force, but I'm just speaking more generally. Police forces are part of regimes, right? So people would say, well, targeting police officers is somehow legitimate. But when you are attacking people who are completely defenseless, that is not resistance. It's not anti-colonial resistance to kill a 5-year-old child. They are not a Zionist or settler colonist. They're not a part of the Borg or some machine or some, if you remember the Avengers movies, there's one point all the aliens come and they all look the same and they're just coming to kill and take over. And that's the only thing they think about. It's not what a 5-year-old child is. Child is someone who hasn't had the opportunity yet to make up their mind about how they feel about the world that they live in. Maybe that child, that settler colonist, will grow up and become the next Benjamin Netanyahu. Maybe they'll be worse. Maybe they'll be the next Jabotinsky. Maybe they'll be the next Martin Luther King or the next Rabbi Prince, who spoke immediately before King's I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. Social theory in general, the post-colonial lens of analysis in particular, have brought us much valuable knowledge and I would argue have made the world a better place, have made us much more aware of abuse and oppression. They're phenomenally important tools in our toolkit. But we do need to be careful about the potential for dehumanization. It is easy to ascribe to people we are criticizing behaviors that they may not all collectively hold. Talk about post-colonial theory, one of the biggest examples of this is the idea of Orientalism. Orientalism was advanced by a Palestinian scholar. Coincidentally, his name is Edward Said. Said basically made the argument that Europeans, as they are looking at the Middle East, instead of seeing it for what it really is or trying to understand it on its own terms, they do a lot of projecting. They project their fears. They project notions of backwardness on people living in the Middle East so they feel better about themselves. Aren't we so technologically advanced? Said's theory has been incredibly important in helping us understand the modern world and, I would say, to deconstruct some of those oppressive structures. At the same time, one can argue that Said's notion of Orientalism, in effect, also made judgments and expectations and stereotypes about Europeans. Okay. The last point I want to make is about some of the problems that we see with resurrecting 19th century notions of land and the national right to territory that are such a core part of a lot of the way people talk about the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. At the heart of this idea is the notion that there are national groups who have established a collective claim to a particular territory, which then establishes their historical and perpetual right to it. This kind of thinking originated, at least as far as I can tell, in Europe in the 19th century. It is a core European idea that gets exported to the rest of the world. It is something that Woodrow Wilson and many of the kind of people who support the idea of the Paris Peace Conference think is going to happen. It's not quite exactly what happens behind the scenes, but it's what's supposed to happen, national self-determination, all that. And it's a kind of thinking that's used to frame the current conflict by many scholars who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. The basic narrative, the Palestinians were there, the Jews showed up and stole their land, and so justice really is giving the land, or at least the power over the land, back to the Palestinians. Setting aside for a moment some of the complications we discussed before about the timings of the emergence of Palestinian identity and its relationship to the Ottoman and Arab identities, this framework is problematic because it rests on the idea that at a certain point in history, a national people acquired the collective ownership of the land. If you want to take this from the Palestinian perspective, when did this occur? Because in terms of political authority, there has never been a Palestinian state. Although at times there have been kind of administrative districts that have been more or less the central heart of what Palestine is today, a lot of times there have not been, including in the run-up to the falling apart of the Ottoman state. There is not a singular district called Palestine that can then easily transition into becoming a national state. Ethnically speaking, we can talk about a large Arab migration to the area starting in the 3rd century. And of course, you have the conquest of Palestine by Islamic forces in the 7th century, around 630. So is that when Palestine was, quote unquote, acquired? You can probably see where I'm going to go here. What happened to the indigenous peoples who were there before the Arabs? Was the Arab conquest of the 7th century an act of imperialism, followed by waves of colonial settlers who gradually displaced the local Jewish and Christian populations? If you're familiar with the Zionist narrative of the founding of Israel, you know this is a popular reason used to justify the foundation of the State of Israel. This narrative goes, the Jews were there first, then the Romans came and expelled them. They created a sort of Jewish Nakba in the 1st century. The Nakba is the term that the Palestinians use to describe kind of the civil war that happens in 47-48 and the expulsion of large numbers of Palestinians from what becomes the initial state of Israel. These Romans, who Christianized the province after the 4th century, but were then in turn themselves displaced by Muslims, were they really the ones who owned the land? There's a kind of meme that makes this argument that you can find online, and it's a picture of the Temple Mount. It shows the Wailing Wall, which is kind of at the bottom of the hill or closer to the bottom of the hill. And then above it, it shows the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And it says something along the lines of, if this is your country, why are your ruins on top of our ruins? Just to get a little more context to the story, too, by the time you get to 1900, there is a very, very small population of Jews living in what we would call the Palestinian lands. We're talking about maybe several thousand, but not a large number. Before the Crusades, there was a large number. There were up to 300,000 Jews living in the region. They get displaced by the Crusaders. The problem here is not that one group's claim is legitimate and the other's isn't. The ancient Hebrews, after all, if you read the Bible, they're not native necessarily to what we would call Judea. They conquer part of the region themselves. Think about the Bible. Think about the whole story of Jericho. The original kingdom of Israel dates to about the 10th or 11th century BC, or BCE if you prefer. They're not the first ones in the region. There are Egyptian colonists there. There are the Philistines. You have conquests by the Assyrians, the Babylonians. So the problem, again, is not that one group is legitimate, that we can go back, we can do the history, and then we can figure out who literally should have the right to that land. The problem is that I can create an origin story that justifies collective national ownership of the land for pretty much any national group. People, until relatively recently, have tended to move around a lot. And of course, you can put an asterisk on that because we're living in the age of globalization. We're living in the age of large-scale refugee and migrant populations moving not just because of persecution, but also for economic reasons. Land has changed hands a lot. And so opinions as to who has the right to do what and which land they should become to occupy are very, very easy to contest, and you can very easily construct narratives that justify violence. Who is the legitimate owner of Texas? Who is the legitimate owner of Alsace-Lorraine? Who is the legitimate owner of Kosovo? This is a huge flashpoint today. Tomorrow, literally, a war could break out in the south part of Serbia, northern Kosovo, over the question of, is that really a part of Serbia? Do Serbs have an ethnic right to it, a historical right to it? Or, since it's mostly Albanian today, should it be an Albanian state, something separate? We talk about German and Polish claims over East Central Europe. We could talk about basically the entire Paris Peace Conference. If you've listened to my podcast episode on the Paris Peace Conference and everything that goes wrong, it leads to incredible amounts of violence and war. I actually titled the episode, for those of you that haven't listened to it, it's titled Infinity Wars. Because all it does is get people saying, this is our land. No, this is our land. Okay, let's fight about it. So I think if we ever want to see peace in the Middle East, we need to move away from this obsession with history and who owns the land, and instead focus on the future. What could a future independent, completely autonomous Palestinian state look like? What could a Jewish state that has recognized this Palestinian state, what could that look like? This brings me to one last little ironic observation. These stories that I have just flushed out about Palestinian and Israeli claims to the land are actually incredibly similar to each other. In fact, you might even describe them as mirror images. Both peoples have long experienced being minorities, victims of oppression. Both assert historical claims to the land that include some sort of catastrophe that robbed them of their majority. The existence of a large Palestinian diaspora has some strong similarities to the position that Jews had before 1948. And the debate over the so-called right of Palestinians to return to Israel echoes debates a century ago where Zionists called for more Jewish immigration and Palestinians or Arabs tended to reject it. Many pro-Palestinian voices now call for the creation of a single state with a relatively permanent Arab majority where Jews would be treated as a protected minority. Many Israelis would argue that Israel is already a single state with a permanent Jewish majority, but one where Arabs either have or should have a sort of special status as a protected minority group. The problem, as we'll see, is that both groups also have the experience of being in the minority, where they were not treated as equals, where they did experience violence and suffering. I don't know how to square this round hole, other than to repeat that history isn't a good guide to deciding, again, who is right and who is wrong. What it can do, however, is help us to understand the perspective and experience of the various parties engaged in the conflict, and perhaps to provide some awareness of potential paths forward for the future. I mentioned a few moments ago the failure of the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. We can also learn a lot by looking at the settlement of World War II, when the various parties, for a variety of reasons, abandoned their faith in the idea that ideology would solve problems, abandoned their emphasis to some extent in the idea of justice, and instead thought in terms of what would be practical. How do we find a way to avoid World War III? Something to chew on for the future. Okay, that's it for our show today. I'd like to thank you for listening. As I said, we'll be following this episode by looking more specifically into some of the history of the Israeli-Palestinian debate, including the emergence of Israeli and Palestinian national movements at the start of the 20th century, the complications of the Mandate period in the 1930s, the various wars in the latter half of the 20th century, and the failed peace process from the 2000s. As always, if you liked what you heard, feel free to subscribe or like, or check out some of our other episodes on the origins of the Ukraine war, or more generally about European history itself. Some of them are about politics and economics. Some of them are about art, culture, the roaring 20s, the kind of new woman, changes to gender and sexuality in the 20s, unification of Germany, all kinds of different things. You can find more details about these on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. Once again, that's www.historyoffthepage.com. That's all for now. Please join us next time as we take history off the page.